Welcome, wrestling fans. So glad to have you back. Season 3 of Wrestler Weekly Conversations. As always, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Wrestler Weekly. Happy to have a great guest with us today. We've had a season full of great guests and seasons full over the first few seasons that we've done. Gotten to talk to some of your favorites, some of our favorites, and we have a great guest with you today. You might recognize him from his book or different experiences through pro wrestling. John Arezzi is here with us today. So you can find his book, Memories, My Wild Life in Pro Wrestling, by John Arezzi and Greg Oliver. There you see the cover right there. Available on Amazon and ECW Press. Definitely worth checking out. You've seen John, or you've heard him on Pro Wrestling Spotlight and his new podcast venture, Memories from Madison Square Garden. A man who is a wrestling historian, somebody we're really proud to have on. John, thanks for coming on and welcome today.
Hey, Mike, it's great to be here. It's good to talk wrestling with you.
Yes, you too, my friend. And so, John, you had a lot of experiences, and one of the things that we mentioned before we came on here was the footage that you have that you've taken from matches at Madison Square Garden. And some of the things that really stood out to me was I had never seen footage of Dory Funk Sr. before. And to see him on one of your roles was incredible. Tell me about your experiences with going with the Garden. I know you have the new podcast where you talk about it, so we don't want to give away everything. But tell me about who were some of your favorites, what you loved about wrestling at that time, and specifically at the Garden.
Well, I mean, that's where I grew up, New York City. I've been a wrestling fan really since 1964 when I was 7. And the Garden was always the Mecca. It was always the place that you wanted to go to. And in New York, there was a law where you could not get into a show in New York at the Garden unless you were 14. So I didn't know that when I first went. When I was 10 years old with my dad, we couldn't get in. So I had to wait till I was 14. And then I started going to the matches. August 30th, 1971 was my first show. Pedro Morales in a bloody match against Stan the Man Stasiak. And after that first live show, I was hooked. I was like, I am all in on this. And for me, I mean, it was as a teenager. And from that day, August 30th, 71, I didn't miss a Madison Square Garden show until mid-77 when I was in college. Went to college in Boston. So for, 71 through mid-77, I did not miss one show at Madison Square Garden. So I started as a fan and then started taking some photographs, antiquated with a little Instamatic camera, they called it back then. And then in 72, late 72, I was like, boy, I would love to have a movie camera so I could take some films here.
Yeah.
And I asked Santa Claus at the time, which were my parents, and they delivered, not an expensive, but just kind of a small little 8mm camera. And I went to Madison Square Garden for the January 1973 show, and I started filming.
Wow.
And I really filmed in 73. A little bit in 74, because by 74, I was then shooting for the magazines as a freelance. I mean, I had a pretty fast rise up the ranks from a fan and then a Fred Blassie fan club president and then as a ringside photographer. But those days filming were really unique for me because I captured some really historic stuff.
Yeah.
Not just Dory Sr. And Terry Funk was there that same night, but Andre the Giant's debut match at Madison Square Garden in March of 73, the same show where Freddy Blassie took on Morales, and I have that only footage of that match of Andre's debut, and that was the first night he called himself Andre the Giant. That was the name Vince McMahon Sr. had given him. So I have a lot of pretty cool historic footage from back at the Garden in 73.
Oh, that's incredible. And it's so cool to hear how you take something, right, that you can only imagine. And here you are, you're doing stuff with the magazines, and you're filming ringside and all these things. What was it like, when you did the Fred Blassie fan club? What was it like when you're starting to meet some of these guys that you're like, oh my goodness, you're larger than life? And obviously, you befriended quite a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, back then when I had Blassie's fan club, and that really ran, I got my permission slip signed by Fred, not personally, a security guard took it backstage at the Garden in December of '71, got it signed. I sent it over to Jeff Walton in California to authenticate it, and it was really his signature. So started the first bulletin in mid '72, I think it was. And then Fred, wrote me letters. I started publishing this monthly little fan publication called King of Men. This is empty over here, because what I used to do when I mailed it out to people is I would actually tape a 3.5 by 5 photograph.
Wow.
Off to the members of the club. But Fred was always cooperative, and I got to meet Fred for the first time at Madison Square Garden, the same show that Andre made his debut. I had received a letter, and I have it here, from Freddy Blassie.
Wow.
Sent to me March 8th, 1973.
Look at that.
On the bottom.
There it is. Yeah, we got it. There's the signature right there.
And it was like, I hope to see you at Madison Square Garden on March 26th. Keep up the good work. And I took this letter with me to the Garden that night. And I went to the security guards over at the dressing room entrance, and they took the letter backstage. And before you know it, I was being ushered backstage. And that was my first time to go backstage at an event. And I was still a kid, and met Fred. And it was just kind of like very, very cool. It was great to be backstage. And the first thing I recall was Bill Apter interviewing Lou Albano and Freddy Blassie backstage. And I just couldn't even believe I was back there.
Yeah.
It was quite the experience. And I went backstage when Fred wrestled there. And it really wasn't until I got my press pass, which is a whole story that's in the book on how I got a press pass to
okay.
sit alongside George Napolitano and Bill Apter and all of those great photographers. But that was very cool for me. The story's in the book. It's a long one. It was just I kind of did an elevator pitch, and Willie Gilzenberg, who was the president of the WWF at the time, figurehead president.
Yes.
So, I mean, I just followed him into an elevator, pushed the wrong floor, so I knew he couldn't get off at the right floor. I gave him an elevator pitch. He told me to come with him to the office, and then Gorilla Monsoon and Arnie Skolin were in there, and I got my press pass, and there you go. I'm sitting alongside those photographers at ringside, and I have backstage access, and that's really where my regular writing and photography career happened for all the newsstand wrestling magazines in the mid-'70s.
Wow, that's incredible. And just to hear some of those names, George Napolitano, we're actually going to have on this season.
Oh, great.
So yeah, we're really excited to talk to him. Because for us here, like the magazines were like, I grew up a child of the 80s, and I remember I grew up in Staten Island, and in Eltingville, there was this little deli, and it had a huge magazine rack. And we would go, from the time I'm talking 4 years old and I can barely read, picking out 5, 6 magazines and going every single month. So to hear, like I said, your history with that and the photos that guys like George and Bill have taken. But a funny parallel to what you were talking about with getting your press pass, a couple, let's say 4 or 5 months ago, I had the privilege, I got to have dinner with Gary Michael Capetta. And he talked about his beginning in getting involved in the wrestling business, and it involved Willie Gilzenberg. I guess they were short a ring announcer, and poor Willie's trying to get in and out of the ring and do it. And Gary went down, and the rest was history. He says, because I got a call a couple of weeks later, my mom goes, "Do you know a gorilla?" And he said the rest was history from there. So what was your experience like working with the magazines and writing the stories? And
it was all cool. I mean, I never forget the first one that was accepted. It was in 1974. And it was through an editor named Tommy Kay. He published out of Arizona, and I sent him a story on Freddy Blassie managing Nikolai Volkov.
Wow.
And he accepted the story, and I got a check for $25, and it was great. And then I just started submitting stories to not only Tommy, because he was the first one to kind of put a story of mine in several magazines. And then I got to know and network with guys like Tom Burke, another really huge wrestling historian who worked most closely with Ring Wrestling magazine.
Yes.
And so I started submitting some articles, and they were published. And then Tom got me a job working for Ring Wrestling magazine in the summer of '76 and '77 while I was attending college. Actually, '75, '76, I think it was. And I was working in the office in the summers, and I was then made a contributing editor for Ring Wrestling magazine.
Wow.
But at the same time, I was still submitting photographs to Bill Apter, and he used a lot of my pictures. Never wrote for Bill in those magazines, but he would buy photos from me pretty regularly. And just it was just kind of like you're always out there sending stuff in, Wrestling News, Norm Keitzer. So, I mean, it really was kind of a fun time for me to be able to constantly submit stories and get a lot of them published. And I got a box in back of me that has every single one of them in there.
Wow.
That I was able to find on eBay, and because over the years you lose them. But I have almost every story I've ever written in a big box in back of me.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Definitely, a great keepsake there. You mentioned Freddy Blassie and your experience with him. And I think, one of the things that I love about Freddy Blassie, and I think a lot of the younger fans, obviously might only remember him as a manager, or, what I mean, and things like that, but he was quite an accomplished wrestler. The great Rock Rims out there on the West Coast has written some great stuff about California wrestling, specifically at the Olympic. And the Freddy Blassie, John Tolos wars. But Freddy was a big star in the ring. And I think, sometimes, like I said, if you're a fan of a certain age, people might remember just Ayatollah Blassie or Classy Freddy Blassie. But not only, one of the most accomplished grapplers, but a vicious grappler, some matches with the Sheik. And it just always seemed to be a wild affair when Freddy got in the ring.
Yeah, that for me, I started reading about Freddy in the '60s in the magazines, and he caused a riot in New Jersey at Roosevelt Stadium when he kicked Bruno Sammartino low in a title match. And I started reading about this guy, and I was very intrigued that he came back from a lot of injuries. He had hepatitis, he lost a kidney, he got stabbed so many times. But the other thing that was really unique was that he was this incredible hated heel on the East Coast, but after the Tola stuff happened on the West Coast, he became this loved and revered babyface. So he'd be on the West Coast as a babyface, come to the East Coast as a heel, and it was really unique that he could be loved on one coast and hated on the other.
Yeah.
But he was an incredible, believable performer. Probably one of the most believable when you put them in the category. I would say Blassie, the Sheik, Abdullah the Butcher, Bruiser Brody. There were guys that basically you were like suspension of disbelief was those guys.
Yeah. And you look at I think it was Johnny Valentine who said, they may not believe that this is real, but they'll believe I'm real.
That's exactly right. You mentioned Johnny Valentine, so happens to have a old Olympic.
Wow, there you go. Look at that.
There's Johnny. I saved this one because Jeff Walton, who was editor, did a nice plug on the Blassie fan club in this.
Oh, that's so cool.
Location. But yeah, just so many great legends,
Yeah. Oh, so many good ones. And one of the things that I specifically said, I got to ask John Arezzi this. We hear about a lot of times, obviously, the great run of Bruno Sammartino. My father grew up on Bruno Sammartino. In fact, Bruno's autobiography was one of the first full-length books I ever read as a kid. And tremendous Bruno fans. I remember my dad telling me him and my uncle going to an outdoor show on Staten Island. It's Bruno and Bill Watts for the title. How much it meant to them and how it made them believe. And but one of the things that you hear about a lot is Bruno and Buddy Rogers. And there's the famous photo of, I think at one of your conventions, right, with Bruno and Buddy. Obviously, you hear, that they weren't great friends or anything like that. But I want to go back to the title match itself, because you hear so many stories about this. Oh, Buddy,
I always have a prop for you. Go ahead. Keep talking.
Okay, all right. So Buddy, they say, Buddy had heart issues, or Bruno said, hey, you're doing this. And what is the real story, the true happening of that championship? And there you see the photo. Look at that. Right there that night with the famous belt there that was recently found.
Yeah, signed by Bruno.
That's wonderful.
I think depends on who you talk to, but I honestly think that they wanted the title on Bruno. Buddy was a bit of a problem child. Buddy was promised the title when they were to lose the NWA title. I mean, he had to drop that strap, and he got the WWF title, the first title holder. But I think they wanted to give it to Bruno, and I think Bruno did tell him in the ring, it's going to be this way, and that's it. And that's what Bruno says.
Yeah.
So I don't, and Buddy's not here, and they're both not here anymore to ask them, but there was always that animosity after that night. I mean, they hated each other.
Yeah.
And getting them together for that photograph, as Georgianne Macropolis did. And I recently found the photographer after all these years who took the backstory on one of my podcasts recently, a guy named Frank Patz Batista, who was a volunteer at the convention and a friend at Georgie's. And she had him take that picture. She convinced Bruno and Buddy to pose together. Wow.
Well, and Georgianne Macropolis was a name that I remember hearing so much about growing up. I mean, the work that she did, I mean, what a legacy she left. And the same for Bruno and Buddy, But what was Georgianne, her influence and all that she did? Because I've never heard anybody say anything negative about her. Just what a wonderful lady she seemed to be.
Amazing person. I met her as a correspondent. I mean, as pen pal, whatever you want to call it, when I was starting up, trying to get the fan club started. And she was running a lot of the fan club columns in the magazines back then. She was also a fan club president for Buddy Rogers and Bruno Sammartino. And then later on started a newsletter called the Wrestling Chatterbox, because she was kind of like a gossip columnist for wrestling, but she was always she was beloved. She helped a lot of people, always was willing to help, make an introduction and just kind of be everybody's mom back then. And one of my biggest memories of Georgianne was when I got accepted into the little clique, I guess you call it, before each Madison Square Garden show. There was a bowling alley upstairs with a little restaurant, and I was invited, and every month we'd have dinner at this little bowling alley restaurant and, show photographs to each other and sell pictures to fans coming in. And it was Georgianne and a guy named Michael Mansky, who I'm still close with after all these years. And it was just kind of a cool thing. But Georgie was always that one person you can go to and get the real scoop from her on anything. And if I wanted, she's the one that introduced me to Bruno when I started Pro Wrestling Spotlight radio show on terrestrial radio in 1989. I asked her, I said, Georgie, I would love to bring Bruno on the show. And she gave me his phone number, made the recommendation. And the next week, my second show on the air, he was on the radio with me.
That's incredible. I've always looked up to Bruno. Just to me seemed like one of the most genuine guys. And, you look at Bruno's rise and you look at, here he is a strong man, right? That you believe can do anything, but he's also this husband and father and just kind of the everyman at the same time. What was your experiences with Bruno?
Always pleasant. From the interviews I did, and I booked him at my first wrestling convention, and my second one and my third one. He was always, and a couple other personal appearances, but he was always somebody that could call up, get on the radio show. He was very outspoken. He was very, he really loved the old school wrestling and hated what wrestling had become. But he was a good man. And he was a good, can I say a friend? I mean, it was more of a business relationship than a personal friendship, but I just admired and respected him from the first time I watched wrestling in 1964, and to the day I found out he passed away. When I was devastated about that, but he was someone I have nothing but fond memories about.
Bruno, to see him, towards the end of his life, I know Triple H was a big proponent in making sure he got back, and Bruno seemed to respect him, and and seemed to be happier with the direction, where that it was more wrestling focused again and things like that. But it meant so much to so many fans. I mean, here he is, 77 years old, and the Garden is screaming his name again. To me, one of the most important figures, not just in wrestling, but in sports history. I mean, you go to Pittsburgh, right? It says home of Dan Marino and Bruno Sammartino, I mean, just what he's meant to so many people is incredible. And he's very much missed.
Yes, he is. Very much so. Good man.
And so, Bruno, one of the things that I think we're surprising to folks, and this was something I wanted to ask you about, is the UWF. Bruno gets involved with the UWF, and there are a million Herb Abrams stories out there. But as I look back, aside from all of the stuff, and all the things, I'm looking back at that and I'm going, wow, Paul Orndorff is here, and Steve Dr. Death Williams is here, young Mick Foley is Cactus Jack. They really did have quite a bit of talent. Did you feel that, obviously I feel like Bruno added a level of credibility, did you know from the start, did you think the UWF could do something, or was it a pipe dream from the start? Or
I think in the beginning, because he introduced and announced the forming of the UWF at my first wrestling convention.
That's right.
And when I first talked to Herb Abrams, I didn't know what to think, but I called Georgie up because when he said Bruno Sammartino's name, I said, all right, let me find out from Georgie. And Georgie said, yeah, I think she introduced Bruno to Herb.
Wow.
Herb was this big wrestling fan in New York, and he was an interesting cat, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't until I got to know Herb that I realized, and kind of, this guy's not going to make it. He's going to blow it. It ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
He didn't have a lot of talent, but he was a goofy guy because he had personal demons.
Yes.
If he didn't have those demons, he certainly had the ambition, was aggressive, but he was always someone who didn't mind getting into a fight or a pissing match with someone.
Gotcha.
And he really wanted to squash Vince McMahon. I mean, you're not going to squash Vince McMahon.
No.
Bringing guys in like Andre the Giant for a taping, and he just would needle Vince. And eventually he got squashed. But once I got to know him, I knew that, there's no way that this promotion is going to really, really take off. He had a ton of talent, but he had a lot of demons, and he was, not the most honest guy in the world.
Gotcha. Yeah. So definitely, like you said, a guy with a lot of ambition. I had never seen it. I recently watched the Blackjack Brawl show because, you hear things and all that. I mean, you look at Herb that night and you're thinking, oh my goodness, like how was this allowed to happen?
Yeah, he flew me out for that show. And I remember, and I didn't do anything. I don't know why he flew me out. I thought maybe he'd have me do some announcing or backstage stuff or whatever, but I didn't do a thing there. But he was out of his mind.
Yeah.
Those 3 days. I mean, he literally was out of his mind, and it really showed if you looked at that tape.
Yeah.
He had a lot of chemicals in him.
Yeah. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, it is. I had first heard of the show. I think I had read, because I remembered vaguely the UWF, and I remember the Beach Brawl show. And I remember, the unveiling of the belt, and with the letters and the FU and all that stuff to Vince. And I mean, it's probably a dime a dozen, right? Promoters that, we're gonna get Vince, and it just, like I said, there always just seemed to be this element that was missing, that like, wow, this could be, because you think, hey, a main of Bam Bam Bigelow and Steve Williams, that could be a good match. You
had John Tolis there as a manager, and you had so many guys. I mean, Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, who he met at my convention, as he did Sunny Beach and Power Twins, and he made a lot of inroads by meeting wrestlers at my convention. But he had a stable of talent that he always says were signed exclusively to him, which was never the case.
Yeah.
And I know, because I'm even reviewing, shows that I'm putting up now for my podcast. Herb is calling in, and it's around the time where he's desperate, and he's picking, and he's filing lawsuits against people for slander and libel, and he's out of his mind. He sued a 14-year-old kid that had a little newsletter called Around the Ring named Andrew Goldberger, because Andrew reported that he bounced some checks, and here he is. He's suing a 14-year-old.
Oh my word!
So I mean, he wasn't shy about filing lawsuits against people. He didn't back anything up. But he was. It was interesting to hear his voice over the last few weeks that I'm doing the podcast now. He'd call up randomly without an appointment to call a show, and I have a guest like a Wade Keller on, or Eddie Hot Stuff, Eddie Gilbert, and there's Herb Abrams is on line 2. I'm like, let's put him on the air. See what he has to say.
Well, and again, I think, with some recent years, I think people do and are starting to look back on Herb with some fondness. Like, this guy may have been nutty, but at least he went out there and tried something.
Well, he was absolutely out of his mind. And when I did Dark Side of the Ring, you find out more. And Sunny Beach, Rick Allen, a Long Island guy, actually became very close to Herb. Worked in the office towards the end. Helped him with promoting some shows in New York, and also inherited Herb's dog, Koki.
Yes, I did. Yeah, Koki.
And has some of the belts still, has some of the UWF belts.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I remember they had, there was like an Israeli championship. They had a lot of belts, but I mean, hey, I'm a belt guy, so I'm totally cool with that. But it's just so cool to see like these different experiences that people have. And, like I said, I think people look fondly back on, all right, the UWF was a train wreck, but, kind of glad it existed, and it's just so funny to look back. And we do see a lot of these things, like what's old is new again, right? You know what I mean? And so I love that you're going back and reviewing your shows. Tell me about your time doing radio and what it was like to be in the wrestling business and doing these conventions and radio shows.
I started a college show in 1975 called Pro Wrestling Spotlight. And at that time, I mean, living up in New England, it was just really a college show, but I liked broadcasting about wrestling, and I'd have guests on, all in kayfabe. And I mean, I really got into wrestling radio as kind of like a, what do I do now? Because I was in artist management. I was in the music business in the 80s. I've left wrestling 3 times. So in the 80s, I was mostly primarily in the music business, and I had a short stint with the New York Mets working in the minor leagues for them.
Yes.
And in 1989, my music business went under. We weren't breaking any acts, and I was like, what do I do now? And it was kind of like, well, I still like wrestling. Maybe I'll go on the air. And I talked to a radio station on Long Island, which I did some work for in sales and a little bit of sports reporting. And I brokered this time slot for Pro Wrestling Spotlight to go on the air. And from April 9th, 1989, right through the beginning of 1995, we had a 6-year run on several different stations. And the show was kind of a really interesting look back at history during that time period. where 89, 90 were interesting, and then the steroid scandals, the sex scandals, the beginnings of the shoot interviews, which I think I'm kind of at the forefront of. I know Ricky Steamboat kind of tore the curtain down a little bit when he was released from the NWA in 1989. And he came on my show to talk about those contract negotiations, which was unheard of at the time. And the newsletters reported on it. Then Jim Hurd came on to answer Ricky. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting more and more of these types of tearing the curtain down guests.
Yeah.
So it really evolved into, just an every week what was going on in the business and reporting on it. Started off kayfabe, but then it kind of turned into this all behind the scenes, week to week news breaking stuff. And so, it was a good ride. And then, I always going into the wrestling convention stuff. In 1990, I was like, I always loved going to baseball card shows to meet some of the New York Met heroes. And, and I was like, why isn't something like this done in wrestling? Vendor tables, autographs. So that's where I had the idea to do one for wrestling fans. And the first one was in 1990. And I called that first one Wrestling Fans Fantasy Weekend. And I was able to get Steamboat and Terry Funk and Cactus Jack and Bruno Sammartino and Sting, who had just won the NWA title. And a number of guys were there. And it was something that people really loved. And then in 91, I did the first weekend of Champions and got Ric Flair. Right after he left WCW. Buddy Rogers, Lou Thez, Superstar Billy Graham, Bruno again, Fabulous Moolah, Rick Rude, Kevin Sullivan, Woman. It was just Jim Cornette. It was off to the races. And then by the third one, it was kind of a annual event looked forward to by wrestling fans. And I'd always try to do something different. 92, I brought Bruno and Larry Zbyszko together for a reunion for the first time, and brought in Jushin Thunder Liger from Japan because I knew the hard would want to see him. And then the following year was my last one, 93, and I brought the original Sheik in for his first and only ever autograph appearance.
Wow. What was that experience like? To me, the Sheik is like the most protected, you know what I mean? There's not, and the book, I know somebody's releasing a book here in the coming year.
Yes.
Already, like the pre-orders are just, you know.
It's gonna be a great book on the original Sheik. But Kevin Sullivan, when I had the idea to bring the Sheik in, I talked to Kevin Sullivan, and Kevin had made the introduction, and he was always a dear friend of mine. He made the introduction to get Ric Flair and give me his number and talk to Flair about the convention in 91. I was like, Kevin, do you think the Sheik would do? Oh, I don't know, John. He was like, I don't know, I'll call him. And he was like, he said he would be interested in doing it.
Wow.
So I actually negotiated it with his wife, Joyce. I never really spoke to the Sheik. Even at the convention, even though he was talking to some people, for me, I was always afraid of the guy when I was a kid. And then, after being smartened up to the business, I still had that, I didn't want to break that suspension of disbelief with him. And I regret today, I would have loved to have had a photograph with him. And I would have loved to have been able to talk to him, but I didn't. I was running around crazy, and I didn't want to break that illusion. Yeah. And the Sheik was kind of in kayfabe the whole time.
That's great.
Big machete, and someone would come up to get his autograph, and he'd slam the machete on the table just to scare people. And then there was one point at the Marriott there, or the Ramada at the time, he was chasing people around the lobby with this big machete. And imagine businessmen coming in to LaGuardia Airport and going across the street to check in at the hotel, and they're seeing a guy chasing around people with a big giant machete. So it was kind of an interesting thing, but I was happy I was there. Two of the people that are friends of mine today that I do the Madison Square Garden podcast with, I put them with the Sheik as a volunteer, and they got to know him, and they started driving him around for his police appearances, and they have great stories. And I'm like, damn, I wish I would have wish I would have hung out with you guys and had to drive around with him, But,
But
that was, out of all of them, I mean, he was kind of like
was.
I didn't break that code, and I didn't get to know him, unfortunately.
I love that though. I think the Sheik is the one guy that I think people are still really interested in finding out about, because we live in this information age where you could throw somebody's name in a Google search and find out anything. And there's not a whole lot of information out there about the Sheik. I mean, even I came across Joyce Farhat's obituary when she had passed away, and it's her beloved Sheik, and the fact that he was even referred to as Sheik at home, I love that.
Yeah, he was an amazing guy, and I never really got a chance. I saw him maybe a handful of times wrestle because he was barred from New York. He had a lifetime suspension because he would cause riots. He scared people, and he would entice the crowd and put them in a frenzy. But they finally banned him for life in the 60s. And I was never able to see him until I believe Joel Goodhart had some shows in the early 90s, and I got to see him actually in person wrestle.
Some tremendous shows, those shows. A lot of those have made their way now online, which you had only heard things, about, especially the Cactus Jack and Eddie Gilbert matches. That seemed to put, that style. There it is right there.
I just bought this on eBay. I found it because I had done the play-by-play for the series of matches.
Wow.
We had released these years and years ago when I had a partnership with Vince Russo. So I found them because I want to digitize them and then put them up on my Patreon page.
Oh, wonderful.
But yeah, that series of matches with Eddie and Cactus was incredible too. I mean,
yeah. Your experiences with Mick Foley, again, one of those guys that so many people look on fondly, and his books brought Mick Foley to life, not just the characters of Cactus Jack or Mankind, but Mick's first book, I think I read 3 times in a year.
I have it on my bookshelf, and I was actually with Mick less than 2 weeks ago. He was here in Nashville. Okay. Doing a stand-up comedy show, at a club called Zanies, and he wrote one of the forwards in my book. So it was actually able to
very cool.
Finally. But yeah, what a man, what a guy. I have to say, in my entire career in wrestling, Mick is probably my best friend in the business.
That's awesome.
As a performer, I have to say Donnie Liable is probably my best friend in the business outside of who a performer was.
Yeah. Incredible. Yeah. Mick's story to me really jumped out, being, when you look at somebody who had a dream and people said, oh, no, not you, and just hearing his passion, but again, a Madison Square Garden event, right? Snuka and Morocco in the cage, still talked about today. How many guys that particular evening influenced is incredible when you see, I think, the reach that pro wrestling has with people. For me, it was always about that connection. Wrestling for me was an escape. It was where I felt safe. It was where I felt good. And I've tried to dig into the history so much over the years, because I remember as a kid, I started tape trading. I'm talking 8, 9 years old, I'm trading tapes. And so my dad would tape me all the current stuff, and I would trade all that for, hey, you got, Portland in 1977, send that my way, or Georgia in 1980. And that's where I learned about all these names, Austin Idol and Buddy Rose and so many people, but, you see the community that's been fostered in wrestling. I'm sure you've seen that in the conventions, what it means to fans to be able to finally put, hey, shake the hand of their hero, somebody that they rooted for, and potentially inspire them to hopefully do the same thing one day, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that was kind of the thing, which one of the reasons I started the conventions is like the fans never had that opportunity to shake a hand. Yeah, and spend a few seconds with somebody, because it was always so secretive, and backstage access was non-existent, obviously, but having the fans have an opportunity to meet their heroes, get a picture with them, get an autograph, spend a few minutes. To me, that was kind of a fulfilling thing, and I promoted those things as a fan because that's what I would have loved to have something like that growing up.
Yeah,
and it's like so big. It's like virtual signings every day of the week.
But that's the beginning of it, right? You know what I mean? I mean, that is the precursor to all these WrestleCades and The Gathering and StarCast, and all those things. And I mean, you'll right, WrestleMania Access Weekend. I mean, it is tremendous. And you see people who are there for days beforehand waiting, because they want to meet their favorite wrestler or tell them, hey, this meant something to me. And I think that's one of the biggest things, like, because I can imagine sometimes it is a thankless kind of business with what gets done and things like that. I had the opportunity about 5-6 years ago to speak with Kevin Von Erich and be like, oh my gosh, you are my, and he was just so gracious and so kind. And, you think about those things and you're like, wow, like, I can't believe I had that opportunity, to do something like that. And again, you talk about, meeting Bruno and talking with him. These are things that people can take forever and just, hey, that 30 seconds was pretty cool, or that 10 minutes, whatever it was. It's incredible. And John, you've helped so many fans have that over the years. That's got to feel really good to know that you've made that kind of impact for so many people.
Yeah, I mean, when I left the business in '96, and when I came back just a couple years ago now, I couldn't believe how many people remembered me and what I did back then with the conventions. And they're all, 30 years older.
Yeah.
But it was heartwarming to me to get that embrace from fans that remembered me from back then. And that's why I think everything that I'm doing today as a historian and sharing archives and sharing the old wrestling shows and sharing the videos from the convention and photographs and 8mm movies. I think my place now, obviously, is a historian, and I would certainly like to do one more convention. And I'm in discussions now with some people about doing a Weekend of Champions 30-year reunion.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Next year in Atlantic City. So I'd love to see that happen, and that would be kind of a farewell for me. But I would make it an event that is not just an autograph show, but it would be combined with award banquets and live wrestling matches and shoot interviews and autograph sessions and private dinners with wrestlers and all these great experiences. So I hope I have one more in me. I hope it happens because I realized that what I was able to do 30 years ago, and it was the beginning of something really special, the connection between the fans and the wrestlers, that today, you could literally find a convention almost every weekend somewhere in the country.
Yeah. And I think like you said, right, that's something special. When I look at things like when I see like the Cauliflower Alley Club, the things that, we had just a few years ago with Brickhouse Brown and, that touching moment, before he passed away, and just to see, I think, so many people who have put their time, their bodies, on the line and did it for the love of it. You know what I mean? To me, just to show the respect to the history, to the people who've made it, is to me one of the things behind Wrestler Weekly. We want everyone to know who put themselves out there for the fans, for following their dreams, all that stuff. We're greatly appreciative, and we want to see the history of pro wrestling live on. And so, but it's guys like you, John, who've done it, who have paved the way for all of us who are trying to have a little piece of it, to be able to celebrate our favorites and our loved ones. And I can't thank you enough for everything that you're doing. And I would definitely love to see a convention, especially come down the road for me in Atlantic City. So, I would love to see that. I'm so glad to see you again back doing things with pro wrestling. It just seemed, like I said, that, like you said, people remembered. And that was the feedback that I was, when you see John Arezzi's back, and it just goes to show, like I said, that if you go out there and you put your heart into something and you give it your all, you could succeed at a lot of really cool things.
Yeah, it's been fun for me. I mean, the podcast has really been a lot of fun, especially over the last couple of months, because somebody that Bob Smith.
Yes.
He is co-hosting the podcast with me now.
Oh, that's awesome.
And Bob was a frequent guest on Pro Wrestling Spotlight 30 years ago. Bob is always somebody I respected. And when I transitioned, because I did a podcast with Arcadian Vanguard, and then that went away, and I was like, well, who do I get to host this thing with me that would really understand the history? And I was like, I wonder if Bob would do it, because Bob and I had a great chemistry years ago, and we spent a lot of time together. So when I talked to him, he was like, are you kidding? I would love to do this.
That's great.
Now we've taped 5 episodes. And it's such a great experience for me each week to talk to Bob and just kind of reminisce about all of these things that we covered years ago. And the podcast, which is called John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight, it's episodic. So now we got to the point where each episode is in chronological order. It's now covering the week of wrestling from 30 years ago to the week.
That's awesome.
Cool. So by the December 3rd episode, each and every week, and now I'm bringing Donnie Leibel back to be part of the podcast, because he used to do a news capsule each week, which would talk about the news of the week.
That's awesome.
Now we're going to call it the Pro Wrestling Spotlight Time Capsule. We're still going to talk about the news that happened 30 years ago. And so he's going to be introduced on December 3rd. So, I mean, it's a lot of fun just going back with the history and having all of these great guests from that time period on. And we got 3 years of shows to go. So that's what I'm enjoying doing. I enjoyed doing the book. And the second podcast, which were from the guys who I introduced the Sheik years ago. And one of the gentlemen, Tim Poutre, was one of the engineers for me 30 years ago at the Long Island radio station.
Wow. So
he's a podcaster, and then the other gentleman, Richie Garcia, from Staten Island, by the way.
There you go.
Staten Island. He came up with this idea. Why don't you were at all these garden shows? Why don't we do a show about you covering the garden 50 years ago? So what we do now is Richie writes it and researches it. Tim co-hosts it with me. And it's called Matt Memories from Madison Square Garden. And it's a monthly show. We drop the podcast 50 years to the day that I went to the garden. So we're dropping the November 15th episode, Freddy Blassie against Pedro Morales, on November 15th. And then December 6th will be the next podcast, 50 years to the day of that garden show that took place December 6th of 71. So it's really it's a niche podcast. You're not going to get thousands of people listening, but you will get people listening who remember that. You're getting a much older demographic on that show, but it's great memories. And as we continue it, I'll integrate backstage interviews I did when I got backstage access. So it's all this stuff that I'm doing now is so much fun for me. I mean, it really is. I'm having a blast. It's almost turned into a full-time endeavor now. And at the age of 64, I mean, this is kind of what I'm doing now. I mean, I'm not in the music business anymore. I'm a couple of years away from retirement, but being able to share this history and my memories, there are not very many people around that can say they went to every Madison Square Garden show for 6 or 7 years.
Absolutely.
Years ago. There's not very many people who can have this history that's in their heads and be able to kind of share these stories with the fans of today.
And I think it's great, you know, and I think even though it might be a niche thing, I think you're going to see a lot of younger fans who really love hearing these things. There are, you know, a lot of younger fans who we've gotten, and I'm one of them, you know. I thrive on the history of it, you know, and you know, my buddy Maddie, you know, who is huge into history, you know, and Scotty and Reggie and all these guys that we get to pal around with on a daily basis. This is the stuff that we're like, oh my gosh, I got to get some of this. And one of the things that was telling, you know, in my first season, I had the pleasure of talking to Barbara Goodish, the widow of the late great Bruno Brody. Very, very cool person. It was so cool to get to talk to her. And she said to me, she goes, I have young men and women who are in their 20s that go, oh man, I watch your husband all the time. And she says, nothing feels better than that there's a whole generation of people who know who Bruiser Brody is. You know, and things like that transcend time. I think, again, the things that you're doing, you know, folks, you can get the book, Matt Memories, My Wild Life in Pro Wrestling by John Arezzi and Greg Oliver. Again, you can get that on Amazon and ECW Press. The great podcasts we just talked about, Pro Wrestling Spotlight and Memories from Madison Square Garden. Again, when Memories from Madison Square Garden comes out, just 50 years to the day of that event. Pro Wrestling Spotlight to the week, 30 years to the week. So you're really getting to take that deep dive into what was going on in the world of wrestling at that time from somebody who lived it. And that's the best experience. You can get John Arezzi on Patreon as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is, if I could just plug that, that's really a place to be. And each and every week, we have well over 150 things for people to take a look at there. And I put 5 or 6 new things every week. For example, I mean, these tapes here, like this one here, this is 1971 or 2 when cassette players first came out. So I'll be uploading this with interviews that were happening back in the day. So, I mean, for fans who want to go to patreon.com/John Arezzi, you get our podcast before it's released. You get it early without commercials. You get the Madison Square Garden podcast without commercials. You get the entire archives of Pro Wrestling Spotlight from April of '89 till the end of the show. You get my college shows there as well.
Wow.
You get videotapes and backstage interviews and tapes when I was a promoter with working with AAA in the mid-90s. Wow, there's so much. I had overseas tours. I have videos of those, and I have those 8mm films, depending on what your level is. And I also mail out to patrons vintage wrestling magazines from the 60s, 70s, 80s, depending on what your level is. So it starts at $5 a month, and it goes up from there, depending on what you want, what type of experience you want with it. But the Patreon account is really giving fans an opportunity to kind of, anytime they want, to log on, and they could just pick and choose. I mean, I put up stuff from the Olympic Auditorium from 1974 recently. There's so much, you know, I got boxes of cassettes that are just the history on these things. I used to tape everything about wrestling when I was a kid, and I saved everything. And it wasn't really until I sold my house here in Tennessee in 2018, I was cleaning out the attic, and I saw these boxes that were all labeled wrestling, and I was like, "There's something here. Maybe I could share this stuff," and that's what happened.
Well, it's working great. Like I said, we're so thankful that you are sharing it with us, that we're getting to relive the history. Like we mentioned at the top of the show, right? So I'd never seen footage of Dory Funk Sr. Never thought I would ever. And to see that was incredible to me. But again, as we mentioned, right, Andre the Giant's first time in Madison Square Garden, first time he's billed as Andre the Giant. This is the stuff that you're getting, folks. You don't want to miss it. There's different levels out there, something for everybody. And again, you can catch John on all social media, right? At John Arezzi, is that correct?
Yeah, at John Arezzi on Twitter, at John Arezzi Instagram, Facebook. There's John Arezzi's Matt Memories. There's a public page and a private group. And on Facebook, there's also a a private group for Pro Wrestling Spotlight. So all you got to do is put John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight or John Arezzi's Memories. And I do vintage auctions regularly. So I kind of give people the opportunity to buy my pieces of my collection.
That's wonderful. That's really cool. So folks, again, you don't want to miss these great opportunities to learn about and envelop yourself in the history of pro wrestling, the great history, to see what got us to where we are today. So fans, we hope that you will continue to join us throughout this season. John is one of many great guests that we're going to have. And we hope that you enjoy it. We hope that you'll follow us on social media at Wrestle Weekly, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And subscribe on YouTube where you're watching this great video right now. We have multiple seasons of this. We have the Wrestle Weekly Presents show with Scotty, where we show off pieces of the collection. And we want to hear from you. Who do you want to see us talk to? Who would you like to hear from on Wrestler Weekly, either Presents or Conversations? So follow us, follow John. You will be thankful that you did. Folks, until the next episode, we'll see you again soon. As Bill Apter used to say, we'll see you at the matches.